Two police cruisers rolled up to the house before Emily Carter had even finished her morning coffee. She watched through the kitchen window as Diane Whitmore stood at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, satisfaction already spreading across her face. Diane had made the call. She'd been planning it for days. A quiet nurse, a young woman who never raised her voice, never pushed back, never caused trouble. Easy. Diane thought this would be over in 20 minutes. But when Emily stepped outside and calmly handed the officer something from her bag, the color drained from Diane's face. And the two patrol officers exchanged a look that said everything was about to go very differently than anyone expected. If this story hits different, follow along until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter had not planned on becoming anyone's problem. That was the honest truth of it. She had moved to Cedar Hollow in late September with her husband, Marcus, and 3 boxes of houseplants she'd managed to keep alive through 2 deployments, a field hospital rotation in a place she wasn't allowed to name on social media, and a cross-country drive in a truck with a broken air conditioner. She wasn't looking for drama. She wasn't interested in neighborhood politics or community boards or whatever social architecture suburban Arizona had constructed for itself. She wanted a house with a yard. She wanted to sleep past 5 in the morning for the first time in years. She wanted, more than anything, to be ordinary. Cedar Hollow was a mid-sized subdivision about 40 minutes outside of Flagstaff, the kind of place where the streets had gentle names like Willow Crest and Amber Ridge, where people put little American flags in their flower beds around the holidays, where everyone waved when they drove by and then talked about you the moment you turned the corner. It wasn't a bad place. Most of the people were fine. The Okafor family 3 doors down had brought over tamales the week Emily and Marcus moved in, and old Mr. Vasquez on the corner always said hello when Emily was out on her morning run. But Cedar Hollow had Diane Whitmore, and that was its own category of problem. Diane was 54, recently retired from a mid-level position at a title company, and she had poured every ounce of her organizational energy into the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, an entity that, as Emily would eventually discover, had questionable legal standing to begin with. Diane had been its self-appointed president for 6 years. She designed the letterhead herself. She collected the fees herself. She sent the violation notices herself, in envelopes with a little HOA logo she'd had made at an office supply store. Emily didn't know any of this when she moved in. She just knew that on her 4th day in the house, a woman she had never met walked up her driveway without knocking, peered around the side of the garage, and started writing something on a clipboard. Emily was on the porch with a cup of coffee. She'd just gotten off a 12-hour night shift at Hargrove Regional Medical Center, where she'd been hired as a charge nurse in the emergency department. She was still in her scrubs. "Can I help you?" Emily asked. The woman looked up. She had the expression of someone who had long since decided she didn't need to be friendly first. "I'm Diane Whitmore, HOA president." "Okay," Emily said. "Is there something I can do for you?" "Your garage door has been left open past 9 p.m. on 3 separate occasions since you moved in. That's a community code violation." Emily blinked. "I didn't know there was a rule about that." "It's in the welcome packet." "I didn't receive a welcome packet." Diane made a small noise that suggested she didn't believe this. "I'll have one sent over. You'll also need to remove the potted plants from the front steps. Decorative items are limited to 1 per entry side." Emily looked at her potted ferns. She had 2 of them, 1 on each side of the door. She'd carried them from Virginia. She said nothing. "There'll be a $20 processing fee for the documentation of violations. I'll send an invoice." And she walked away. Marcus came home an hour later and found Emily still on the porch, coffee gone cold, ferns sitting exactly where they'd always been. She told him what happened. $20 for the documentation, he repeated. That's what she said. Marcus was a high school history teacher. He was patient, methodical, and had the specific kind of calm that came from spending 8 hours a day explaining the fall of Rome to 17-year-olds. He looked at the ferns. He looked at Emily. "We're not paying that." "No," Emily agreed. "We're not." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Over the following 3 weeks, Diane sent 4 more letters. Each one escalated. The The first cited lawn maintenance deficiencies because the new grass seed Marcus had planted wasn't yet visible, a fact Diane noted as evidence of neglect. The second addressed a trash bin that had remained curbside for 4 hours after collection. The third was a demand for proof of homeowner's insurance, which Emily provided, only to receive a fourth letter claiming the documentation format was unacceptable. And then came the fees. The first one was $60, described as a community standards compliance fee. The second was $150 for what Diane called an administrative review surcharge. Emily looked up every document she could find related to Cedar Hollow's HOA, including the county records, the original subdivision agreement, and the state statutes governing homeowners associations in Arizona. What she found was a patchwork. The HOA had been formally dissolved 8 years earlier when the original developer went bankrupt. Diane's current version of it had never been properly reconstituted. The fees she was charging had no legal basis. Emily didn't say any of this yet. She documented it. Old habits. Meanwhile, Diane had started working the neighborhood. Emily could see it. The way conversations would stop when she came out to her car, the way Mrs. Turnbull from across the street suddenly stopped waving. Someone had been telling stories. Emily didn't know what the stories were exactly, but she could guess the shape of them. New people, kept to themselves. Probably wouldn't last. What Diane did not know, what none of them knew, was what Emily Carter had done for the 6 years before Cedar Hollow. Emily had enlisted in the Army at 22, shortly after completing her nursing degree. She'd been assigned to a forward surgical unit and spent her first 2 years in environments where the difference between a decision made in 3 seconds and one made in 5 seconds was whether someone came home or didn't. She cross-trained as a combat medic. She completed a federal emergency response certification that most civilian nurses never even heard of. She'd triaged mass casualty events in conditions that would have broken most people, kept her hands steady in temperatures of 110 degrees, and learned to make calls with incomplete information because incomplete information was the only kind available. She left the Army at 28, not because she was forced out, but because Marcus had been offered a permanent position in Arizona, and they had agreed together that it was time to build something stable. She still held her federal credentials. She maintained her certifications. She still ran 5 miles a day at 5 in the morning, not because anyone told her to, but because her body had been trained to need it. None of this showed. That was in some ways the point. She had spent years learning how to blend into a room, how to be unread, how to let other people underestimate her because it was occasionally useful and almost always less exhausting than the alternative. Diane Whitmore had read Emily Carter as a soft target. It was the most expensive mistake she'd made in years. The confrontation happened on a Thursday morning in mid-October. Emily was home, which was unusual. She'd traded a shift so she could deal with a plumbing issue in the guest bathroom. She was in the driveway, waiting for the plumber, when Diane came down the sidewalk with the kind of purpose that suggested she'd been working herself up to this. "We need to talk," Diane said. "Good morning," Emily said. "I've sent you multiple notices. You haven't responded to any of them." "I've read them." "Then you know you owe $300 in community violation fees." Emily kept her voice even. "I know you've sent letters claiming I owe that amount. I also know the Cedar Hollow HOA was legally dissolved in 2016, and the organization you're operating doesn't have the authority to levy fees against property owners in this subdivision." Diane's chin came up. "That is incorrect. I have the county records. Those records are outdated. They're from 2023. Something shifted in Diane's expression. Not retreat, not yet, but a recalibration. She'd expected pushback in the form of confusion, or apology, or a check written just to make things go away. She hadn't expected documentation. "You don't get to just ignore my rules," Diane said, and her voice had an edge in it now. "This community has standards, and people who move in here need to understand that we have expectations." "What standards?" Emily asked. "What specific legally enforceable standards are you referring to?" "You know what? I don't need to stand here and debate this with you." Diane pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. You're creating a hostile situation, and I want it on record." Emily said nothing. She clasped her hands behind her back. a posture she'd developed in the army, the one that looked like patience but was actually just conservation of energy, and waited. The cruisers arrived 11 minutes later. Two of them, Officers Graves and Pacheco, according to their badges. Diane met them at the end of the driveway with her clipboard and what Emily could only describe as performance confidence, the body language of someone who believed she was about to win. "Thank you for coming," Diane said. "This woman is refusing to comply with lawful community orders and has become hostile toward me." Graves looked at Emily. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's going on here?" "I'm standing in my driveway waiting for a plumber," Emily said. "I've been standing here since 8:45. "She's in violation of HOA regulations," Diane interjected. "Has there been any physical altercation?" Graves asked. "No," both women said at the same time. "Has she threatened you in any way?" he asked Diane. A pause. "She's been hostile." "Hostile how?" Another pause, shorter. "Her attitude." Pacheco, who had been quietly scanning the property and the surrounding area, made a note on his pad. "Ma'am," he said to Emily, "I'm going to need to see some ID." "Of course." Emily reached into her jacket pocket and produced her driver's license. Then she reached into the inside pocket, the flat one, sewn in, and pulled out a second card. She handed it to Pacheco without comment. He looked at it. He looked at it for a moment longer than he'd looked at the license. Then he showed it to Graves. It was a federal medical credentials card, the kind issued to medical personnel with clearance-level emergency response authorization. Emily's name, her photo, a series of code identifiers that, to someone who knew what they were looking at, said a great deal about where she'd been and what she'd been certified to do. Graves looked up from the card. There was a different quality to his attention now. Not warmer exactly, but more careful. "You were military medical?" "Forward surgical unit," Emily said. "Combat medical specialist. Federal emergency response certification, maintained current." He handed the card back. "Ma'am, I apologize. I didn't know." Diane was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who had just watched a hand of cards she was certain she'd won get turned face up to reveal something she didn't account for. "What does that have to do with anything?" she demanded. Neither officer answered her. "She still hasn't paid her fees," Diane pressed. "She's been in violation for over a month." Graves turned to her, and his manner had shifted. Not aggressive, but no longer accommodating. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about this HOA you're representing." "I'm the president. I've been president for 6 years." "Can you provide documentation of the organization's legal status?" The clipboard tightened in Diane's grip. "I have letters and records. Documentation of legal standing with the county, incorporation records, authorization to levy fines." Diane's mouth opened, then closed. Emily said nothing. She watched Diane rearrange her expression, watched her try to locate the authority she'd walked in here with and find it had somehow slipped out of reach. Pacheco had pulled out his phone and was running something. Emily suspected he was verifying property records. She had already given him the address. She already knew what he was going to find. "The property is clear," Pacheco said to Graves. He looked at Emily. "No violations on record. No active legal HOA authority attached to this subdivision according to county records." "Those records are wrong," Diane said, but her voice had lost its edge. It was smaller now, defensive. "Ma'am," Graves said to her, and the word had a weight to it. "Filing a false police report is a serious matter. If no crime was committed here and no legal authority was violated, then we have a different kind of conversation to have." "I didn't file a false report. She was hostile. You told the dispatcher this resident was trespassing on property and refusing lawful orders." This is her property. She was standing on her own driveway." Graves closed his notepad. "I'm going to need you to stay here for a moment." He walked away, presumably to make a call. Pacheco remained jotting notes, not looking at either of them. Diane stood with her clipboard and her logo-printed paperwork and the fading certainty of someone who had built an entire social structure on the assumption that no one would ever look too closely. Emily watched her. She had seen this particular unraveling before, in different settings, under different pressures, The moment when someone who had spent years operating on unchecked authority encountered a wall they couldn't talk their way through. It never looked graceful. "I didn't realize it would go this far," Diane said, finally, and it wasn't clear who she was saying it to. Emily didn't respond. She heard the plumber's truck turning onto the street at the end of the block. Graves came back. He had a different quality to his walk, the kind that meant the call had confirmed what he already suspected. He spoke to Diane directly, and his voice was measured but had no warmth left in it. "We're going to need to document this. You're going to need to provide whatever paperwork you have for this HOA organization to the county assessor's office by end of business Friday. If the organization cannot demonstrate legal authority to operate, any fees you've collected from residents will be subject to review." Diane went very still. "Additionally, we're filing a report on the circumstances of this call. A supervisor will be in contact." Across the street, Mrs. Turnbull had come out to check her mail. She was not checking her mail. She was watching. Emily could see two other neighbors, the Delgado family, she thought, standing at their front window. Word traveled in Cedar Hollow. That was one of its defining features. The plumber pulled into the driveway, got out, looked at the two police cruisers, the officer with his notepad, and the HOA president standing with a clipboard and an expression like she'd swallowed something sharp. "I'm here for the bathroom thing," he said to Emily. "Go on in," she told him. "Door's unlocked." He went in. Diane was still standing at the end of the driveway when Graves finished his documentation. She didn't leave right away, which Emily found interesting. She seemed unable to, somehow, as if leaving would require admitting that she'd lost the ground she came here to hold, and she hadn't yet found a way to frame that to herself. "This isn't over," Diane said. Emily looked at her. Just looked, without anger, without satisfaction, without anything that could be called a reaction. She had learned a long time ago that silence, in the right moment, said more than any argument. It was the kind of quiet that Diane Whitmore had never had to deal with before, the kind that didn't give her anything to push against. She left. Officer Graves handed Emily a card with the report number and told her the department would be following up. Pacheco nodded at her in a way that was almost respectful before they both got back in their cruisers. Emily went inside. She made a fresh pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the plumber worked in the guest bathroom, the sound of his tools carrying down the hall. She pulled up the county website and confirmed what she already knew: the HOA's filing status, the dissolution date, the complete absence of any reconstitution record. She took a screenshot. She added it to the folder she'd been building for 3 weeks. Statements, letters, fee invoices with no legal basis, dates, times, the exact language Diane had used in each exchange. Marcus called on his lunch break. "How'd the plumber thing go?" "Fine," she said. "We also had a police visit." A pause. "Did Diane do something?" "She called them on me." A longer pause. "And?" Emily looked out the window at the quiet street, at the neighbors who were no longer at their windows, but who she knew were still thinking about what they'd seen. At Diane Whitmore's house 3 doors down, where the curtains were closed even though they usually weren't. "They left," she said, "and I don't think Diane had a good morning." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said, and she meant it, which she suspected he already knew. "I'll tell you the rest tonight." She hung up, drank her coffee. The plumber called from down the hall that the issue was a worn seal and he could have it fixed in 20 minutes. Outside, the autumn light was moving across the yard in the particular way it did in Arizona, slower than it looked, warmer than it had any right to be that late in the year. The ferns on either side of the door caught it and held it. She hadn't moved them. She was not going to move them. Down the block, she saw Mrs. Turnbull walking toward the house, still carrying her mail, which she'd had in her hand for the better part of 20 minutes. Behind her, the Delgado woman, Rosa, Emily thought her name was crossing the street in the same general direction. They weren't walking together. They hadn't planned this. But they were both coming, and Emily could see it on their faces before they got close enough to speak. They had things to say, things they'd been holding for a while. And something about this morning, the cruisers, the clipboard hitting the pavement when Diane's grip slipped, the federal card that changed the temperature of the entire conversation, had made them decide that today was the day to say them. Emily stood up and went to open the door. Mrs. Turnbull got to the door first. She was a small woman in her late 60s, white-haired, with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to measure how much she revealed about herself in public. She held her mail against her chest like a shield she wasn't sure she still needed. "I saw what happened," she said. "I want you to know that." "Come in," Emily said. Rosa Delgado was 3 steps behind. She was younger, mid-40s, Emily guessed, with paint on her forearm from what looked like a home project interrupted. She nodded at Emily in the way people nodded when they didn't quite have words yet, but needed you to know they were on your side. They sat at the kitchen table. The plumber's radio was going down the hall, something country and low. Emily put coffee in front of both of them without asking if they wanted it, because sometimes that was easier than making people feel like they'd arrived at a formal meeting. "Mrs. Turnbull. Patricia, please. I've been Mrs. Turnbull for 40 years, and it still sounds like I'm being sent to the principal's office," spoke first. "She started on us about 2 years ago," Patricia said. "My husband Dale put up a mailbox post. Just replaced the old one, same spot, same color, wood post instead of metal. She sent a letter saying it violated aesthetic continuity standards." She paused. "I had to look up what aesthetic continuity meant. Dale just laughed, but then the fine started." "How much?" Emily asked. $40 the first one, then $60. Then she said there'd be a compounding fee if we didn't pay within 30 days. Patricia's hands were flat on the table. "We paid it. We shouldn't have. But Dale was sick that year, and I didn't have the energy to fight." Rosa wrapped both hands around her mug. "She told us we couldn't park our truck in the driveway overnight, said it was a commercial vehicle." Her voice was careful, measured. "It's a pickup truck. My husband uses it for work, yes, but it's registered as personal. She had no basis for that. We pushed back, and the next week she told the Garcias that we were planning to run a business out of the house. Just said it to them at a block party. Completely invented." "Did you document it?" Emily asked. Rosa nodded. "Some of it, not enough." The plumber appeared in the hallway, wiping his hands on a rag. "Seal's replaced. Good to go. I'll email the invoice." Emily thanked him, and he let himself out, the front door clicking shut behind him. The 3 women sat with the quiet for a moment. "She's been doing this for years," Patricia said. "The whole street knows it. But nobody wanted to be the one to, I don't know, stand up and have her turn the full weight of it on them." She looked at Emily. "You didn't seem afraid of her." "I'm not," Emily said. It wasn't bravado. It was just true, the way a lot of things were true. Not because she'd made a decision about them, but because of what she'd been through before Cedar Hollow. "What was that card?" Rosa asked. "The second one you gave the officer." Emily turned her coffee cup a quarter turn. "Federal medical credentials from when I was in the military." Rosa absorbed this. "You were in the Army?" 6 years. Patricia looked at her with an expression that was partly reassessment, partly something that looked like relief. Like she'd been waiting without knowing it for someone who wasn't going to fold. "So what happens now?" Rosa asked. "The officers are documenting it," Emily said. "Diane has to show the county that the HOA has legal authority to operate, which it doesn't." She paused. "But that process takes time, and in the meantime, she's still going to try to make noise." "She will," Patricia said. "That's all she knows how to do." Emily nodded. "So we build a record. All of you. Anyone who's received letters, fee demands, any kind of written communication from her. I want copies, dates, amounts, the whole thing. We put it together." Rosa looked at her. "What are you going to do with it?" "File a formal complaint with the county housing authority. And if the fees she's collected add up to what I think they might, we talk to the state attorney general's office about consumer fraud." Patricia set her coffee down with a small sound that might have been surprise. "Consumer fraud." "She's been collecting money she had no legal right to collect, from multiple homeowners over multiple years." Emily looked at both of them evenly. "That's not a neighborhood dispute. That's a pattern." There was a pause, the kind that meant people were rearranging what they'd believed was possible. "I'll get you everything I have," Patricia said. "So will I," Rosa said. "And I know the Garcias will too, and probably the Nguyens on Amber Ridge. She went after them over a fence line last spring. Emily wrote down her email address on the back of a takeout receipt because she didn't have any other paper immediately handy, which felt imprecise and very human and completely fine. She slid it across the table. "Give me a week," she said. That evening, Marcus came home to find the kitchen table covered in papers. He stood in the doorway for a moment, tie loosened, reading the room. Then he put down his bag and said, "How many people did she do this to?" "At least 7 households that I know of so far," Emily said, without looking up from her laptop. "Probably more." He pulled up a chair beside her. He didn't ask if she needed help because he knew her well enough to know that she'd tell him what she needed and he should wait for that moment. Instead, he picked up one of the letters, a demand from Diane to the Nguyen family for $180 over a decorative wind chime, and read it through. "She made up a rule about wind chimes," he said. "She made up a lot of rules." Marcus set the letter down. "You're building a case." "I'm organizing information. There's a difference." "There isn't, actually." Emily looked up and almost smiled. "No, there isn't." He got up and made them both sandwiches because he was practical in the ways that mattered, and they ate at the corner of the table while she cross-referenced dates and matched letter copies against county records. The HOA dissolution was in 2016. Diane's first documented fee demand to any resident was 2018, 2 years of operating something that didn't legally exist. "This is bigger than I thought it was," Emily said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice when she said it. Just the particular flatness of someone who had suspected a thing and now had to sit with the confirmation. "How much total? Across all of them?" She added it in her head. It wasn't hard. "Somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. I won't know exactly until I have everyone's records." Marcus was quiet. Outside, the neighborhood had gone to the particular evening quiet of suburban Arizona. Sprinklers somewhere. A car on the next street over. One dog that had opinions about something. Normal sounds. The kind Emily had missed for years without quite knowing how to name that missing. "You know she's going to come back at you," he said. "I know. She's not the kind of person who accepts that she lost. Also know that." He looked at her. "You're not worried." It wasn't a question, really. He was checking in, which was different. "I'm a little worried," she admitted. "Not about her, about the process. These things drag. People get tired. The Nguyen's, they've got 2 kids and a business. I can't ask them to keep fighting if it runs a year." Marcus considered this. "Then you do what you can do, and you let other people make their own choices about how far they go." Spoken like a history teacher. Spoken like someone who's watched you do this before. He picked up his sandwich. "You fixed 3 separate equipment failures in a field hospital by yourself. You can handle Diane Whitmore." "Those are very different problems." "Yeah, Diane Whitmore is easier." Emily thought about that for a moment and then decided he was probably right. By Friday morning, the emails had started coming in. Rosa sent everything she had. 6 letters, 2 fee invoices, and a screenshot of a text message Diane had sent her husband in which she threatened to escalate to enforcement action if the truck wasn't moved within 48 hours. Enforcement action, as if she ran an agency. The Nguyen family, Helen and David, sent a detailed PDF that David had clearly put together himself, which was organized by date and included highlighted passages. Emily looked at it for a long moment and felt something she couldn't quite categorize. Gratitude, maybe? Or the specific weight of understanding that she wasn't the only one who'd been keeping records while trying to look like they weren't keeping records. The Garcias added 2 letters and a handwritten note from Miriam Garcia that said simply, "She told our son we might have to leave the neighborhood. He was 12. He cried." Emily read that twice. Then she put it aside carefully, separate from the others, and she didn't say anything about it, but she noted it. It would matter later. On Saturday, she drove to the county records office and stood in line for 40 minutes, and then spent 90 more in front of a microfiche reader confirming what she already knew about the HOA dissolution. She got certified copies. She paid the $14 fee. The woman behind the counter was helpful and uninterested, which was exactly what Emily needed. On the way home, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. The message was from a woman named Sandra Pratt, who identified herself as Diane Whitmore's attorney. The message was pleasant in the particular way that messages from lawyers were pleasant when they were also warnings. She said that her client had become aware of Emily gathering documents from neighbors, and that any effort to damage her client's reputation or interfere with legitimate community operations would be considered harassment and dealt with accordingly. She said she looked forward to a professional resolution. She said, "Have a nice day." Emily played the message twice. Then she called the number back. Sandra Pratt picked up on the second ring. "This is Emily Carter," Emily said. "Returning your call." A slight pause. "Ms. Carter, thank you for calling back. As I said in my message, I heard the message. I want to be clear about something." Emily's voice was even. She was standing in her driveway, keys still in her hand, the certified county records on the passenger seat. "Your client has been collecting fees from residents of this subdivision under the authority of an HOA that was legally dissolved in 2016. That's documented. The residents who paid those fees have copies of every demand letter. I have certified records from the county. What I'm doing isn't harassment, it's documentation. If your client has a legal basis for any of this, I'd genuinely like to see it." Silence. "I'll pass that along," Sandra Pratt said, and some of the pleasantness had gone out of her voice. "I'd appreciate that," Emily said. She hung up. Stood there for a moment in the dry October heat. A bird she couldn't identify was making noise somewhere in the oleander along the fence line. Then she went inside and sent everything she had to the county housing authority. The complaint was 14 pages. It included the dissolution records, 7 households' worth of fee demands, and letters, the total estimated amount collected, and a timeline she'd built from dates and documents rather than memory. She attached the county records as certified copies. She noted the contact information for each affected household. She was precise, and she did not editorialize, and she let the document speak. She hit send. And then she had a strange, suspended moment, the kind that happens sometimes when you'd been working towards something for days, and then it was done, and your body didn't quite know what to do with the absence of the task. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at nothing in particular and breathed. She didn't know how long it would take. These things moved at their own pace. There'd be a review, probably an inquiry, maybe several rounds of correspondence before anything official happened. Diane would push back. Her attorney would be involved. The process would be slow and sometimes frustrating, and she would have to manage other people's patience as much as her own. But the record was there now. That was what mattered. But 3 days later, the notice arrived. Not from the county, from Diane. It was slipped under the door overnight, which Emily thought was a particular choice, the kind of thing you did when you wanted the effect without the confrontation. It was on the HOA letterhead, the logo that Diane had paid to have designed, and it said that due to repeated violations and community disruption, Emily and Marcus Carter were being formally notified of a $600 assessment for cumulative noncompliance, to be paid within 15 days or escalated to legal proceedings. Emily photographed it, added it to the file, forwarded it to the county housing complaint she'd already submitted, and then sent a copy to Sandra Pratt with a single sentence. "This was delivered after your call." Noted for the record. She did not hear back. What she did hear 2 days after that was from Officer Graves, who called and told her the department had completed their initial report on the false police call and that the matter had been referred to the county prosecutor's office for review. He was professional, careful, giving her only what he could appropriately share. But at the end of the call, he said, "You handled that morning well, Ms. Carter," and the way he said it suggested he didn't give that particular assessment often. Emily said thank you and meant it. And then, on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after the police cruisers had sat in her driveway, something happened that she hadn't expected. Marcus called from the school parking lot, which was where he called from when he had something to tell her and didn't want to start the conversation in the middle of driving. "You have a message on the community Facebook group," he said. Emily didn't use the community Facebook group. She hadn't joined it. "What message?" "Someone screenshotted it and sent it to me. It's from Diane. She's telling the neighborhood that you've been spreading misinformation and that your complaint to the county is based on falsified documents." Emily was quiet for a moment. "She's saying you forged the county records." "That's—" Emily stopped herself, took a breath. "Those are certified copies. The woman at the records office stamped them." "I know that." If she's claiming they're falsified, she's either not thinking clearly or she's... Emily stopped again. Something cold and precise moved through her. She's trying to discredit me publicly before the county can respond. That's what it looks like to me, too. Emily set down the coffee cup she'd been holding. Outside the kitchen window, the street was quiet. But she knew it wasn't, not really. People were on their phones. People were reading Diane's post and not knowing what to think. Emily? Marcus's voice was careful. She's copying your employer in the post. What? She tagged Hargrove Regional, saying the hospital should be aware that one of their employees is involved in a neighborhood harassment campaign. The room felt different for a moment. Not smaller exactly, just more specific. Hargrove Regional. Her job. Her license. She stood very still. The training kicked in before the emotion could, not to suppress it, but to put it somewhere useful and deal with the situation in front of her. She had done this in worse rooms than her kitchen. Forward me the screenshot, she said. Already did. And send it to the Housing Authority complaint email, the one I gave you. Already did that too, she exhaled. Okay. What are you going to do? Emily looked at the certified county records still sitting in their folder on the edge of the counter. At the 14-page complaint she'd spent a week building. At the 7 families who had trusted her with their documents and their stories, including Miriam Garcia's handwritten note about her 12-year-old son. I'm going to call HR first thing in the morning, she said. Get ahead of it. And after that, she picked up the folder, straightened the edges, set it back down. After that, I'm going to find out who Diane's been talking to at the hospital. Marcus went quiet for a beat. You think she has a contact there? I think she didn't tag a hospital she'd never heard of. Emily's voice was flat. She's been researching me. She knows where I work. She knows the name of the department. The silence between them carried the weight of the same thought arriving at the same time. That's not a neighbor with a grudge, Marcus said. No, Emily said. It isn't. She hung up, stood in the kitchen. Outside, the October night had cooled the way it only did in Arizona when the sun dropped. Sudden, total, like a light being switched off. In the house across the street, she could see the blue flicker of a television through the curtains. She opened the email Marcus had forwarded. Read the post. Read the tag. Read the comment thread below it, where 3 people had already responded. 2 she didn't know, and 1 she recognized. A username she had seen before, in a context that had nothing to do with Cedar Hollow. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened a new email and began to type. The username was Triple Pine AZ. Emily had seen it before in a comment thread on a neighborhood watch forum she'd browsed briefly when they first moved in. One of those loosely moderated local boards where people posted about package thieves and coyote sightings and the occasional noise complaint. Triple Pine AZ had been a frequent commenter, opinionated, quick to pile on, the kind of account that had been active for years and never posted under a real name. She ran a search on the username across 3 platforms. Same account, same patterns. Always commenting on Cedar Hollow adjacent content, always supportive of Diane's positions in the neighborhood group, always appearing within hours of anything Diane posted. It wasn't proof of anything. It could have been a coincidence, a neighbor who happened to agree with her, someone Diane had recruited into her orbit. But the comment under Diane's post had said, "This woman has been a problem since day 1. Ask anyone who knows her work history." Her work history. Not her yard. Not her fence. Not her trash bin timing, her work history. Emily saved the screenshot, added it to the folder, and sat with the specific discomfort of understanding that this had moved. It was no longer a neighbor dispute inflated by a woman with a clipboard and a need for control. Something deliberate was happening. Someone had done research and fed it to Diane, or had been feeding Diane information for longer than the fence and fee letters suggested. She closed the laptop and went to bed, because she had a 6 a.m. shift and she had learned, over years of doing work that required her brain to function under pressure, that sleep was not optional even when sleep felt impossible. She lay in the dark for 20 minutes before her body understood she meant it. The HR call happened at 7:45 in the morning, in the break room between the end of handoff and the start of rounds. Karen Wills, the department's HR liaison, was a careful woman who had been doing this job for 15 years and had the specific quality of someone who'd heard a lot of things and learned to reserve judgment until she'd heard all of them. She listened to Emily explain the situation, the HOA dispute, the county complaint, Diane's Facebook post, the hospital tag, without interrupting. When Emily finished, Karen said, "She tagged the hospital directly?" "In the post, with the department name. And the claim is that you've been harassing her? That I've been running a harassment campaign against a community leader and falsifying county documents." Karen was quiet for a moment. "Emily, I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not going to have a problem doing my job here, which is protecting the hospital from liability and protecting staff from unwarranted external pressure. But I do need you to send me everything you have. I'll send it today. The certified records specifically. Those too." "Okay." Karen paused again. "Has anyone from administration contacted you directly?" Something in the phrasing made Emily pay attention. "No, should they have?" Karen took a beat too long before answering. "A complaint was filed with administration early this morning before I was in." Emily's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "From who?" "I can't tell you that yet. I'm sorry." "Was it Diane Whitmore?" Silence. "Karen, I can't confirm names at this stage. I want you to know I'm taking your version seriously, and I'm going to move on this today. That's all I can say." Emily thanked her and hung up, stood in the break room for the 30 seconds she had to stand there and feel the shape of what was happening. Then she put on her badge and walked back onto the floor. The ER at Hargrove Regional was a mid-sized department, 22 beds, 2 trauma bays, rotating staff of about 60. Emily had been charge nurse for 4 months and had already built a reputation for being the kind of person you wanted running the floor during a bad shift. She knew who worked well under pressure and who needed extra direction. She knew which physicians had good hands and which ones had good instincts, which wasn't always the same thing. She had held her own in rooms where people twice her age had assumed she was support staff. The shift ran normally until 11:22. That was when the radio call came in. It was a multi-vehicle collision on Route 17. 5 vehicles, estimated 12 casualties, 2 confirmed critical. ETA 8 minutes. The department had been at 80% capacity since 9, which meant they needed to move fast. Emily was already talking before the call finished. Triage in the ambulance bay. Graves and Morrison on Trauma 1, Patel on 2. We need 2 beds cleared in the main bay, now. Delacroix in 14 is waiting on imaging. Get him moved to overflow. Marchetti in 9 is stable, same. Kowalski, call the on-call surgical team. Tell them we may need OR2 on standby. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She moved. This was the part of her that Cedar Hollow had not seen and could not imagine from looking at the woman who'd stood quietly in her driveway with her hands behind her back. She had run scenes like this in the field, not hospital bays with functioning equipment and backup 20 feet away, but conditions that stripped every safety net and left you with your training and your judgment and nothing else. What that had done to her, among other things, was remove the performance of competence. There was no time for performance. You either knew what you were doing or you didn't, and you found out fast. The first ambulance pulled in at 11:30. A 53-year-old man with suspected internal bleeding, GCS of 12, BP dropping. Emily assessed him in under 90 seconds, called Trauma 1, ordered a fast exam and a type and cross match for 2 units of O negative, and moved to the second incoming before the first was settled. Second patient, a teenager, 19, with a femur fracture and road rash covering the left side of her body. Conscious, extremely frightened, asking for her mother in a voice that had gone thin and high from pain. Emily put her hand on the girl's wrist. Not for the pulse, she'd already checked the pulse, but because sometimes the most medically useful thing you could do was let a terrified person know there was a body present that wasn't afraid. "Your mom's going to be here," Emily told her. "We're going to take care of your leg. What's your name?" "Jess." "Jess? I'm Emily. Do you have any allergies?" "No, is it bad?" "You've got a fracture. We're going to get you something for the pain first, and then we're going to take some pictures and decide what to do. You're not alone in here." The girl nodded. Emily was already moving. The next 4 hours ran on adrenaline, muscle memory, and the kind of communication that happened between people who'd worked together long enough to anticipate instead of ask. They lost one patient, a 61-year-old man with a traumatic brain injury who had come in already too far gone, whose wife arrived 40 minutes later and sat in the family room while Emily stood in the hallway outside and took 2 full breaths before going in to tell her. That was the part nobody trained you for, the part that stayed, the part that had nothing to do with protocol. She sat with the woman for 6 minutes, not because policy required it, it didn't, but because the woman couldn't be left alone in that room and the chaplain was occupied, and sometimes you were the person who was there. When Emily came back to the floor, Dr. Reed, the attending who'd led the trauma bay, fell into step beside her. "Good call on the OR2 standby," he said. "We needed it." "I thought we might." He looked at her sideways. He was a tall man, late 40s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been impressive long enough that he didn't feel the need to demonstrate it. "How long did you do field work?" 6 years. "It shows." He paused. "In the best way." She nodded and moved on because the shift wasn't over. Bomb. She got out at 6:45. Marcus had texted 3 times and she hadn't seen any of them. She called him from the parking garage. "Karen Wills called me," he said, instead of hello. Emily stopped walking. "She called you?" "She said she needed to reach you and you weren't picking up. She wanted you to call her back tonight, said it couldn't wait until morning." Emily called Karen's cell. Karen picked up on the first ring. "I found out who filed the complaint." "Tell me." "Her name is Lorraine Voss. She's listed as a community advocate on Diane Whitmore's HOA documentation, the informal version, the one that has no legal standing. She works part-time at Hargrove in Billing, 3rd floor." The air in the parking garage was cold and smelled like concrete and exhaust. Emily stood very still. "She's an employee." "She filed an internal complaint against you through the employee ethics portal. She claimed you'd been using hospital resources to document and harass a community organization. She also claimed you had accessed patient records inappropriately." Karen's voice was flat and controlled. "The second claim is obviously serious enough that administration had to open a review." "That's false." "I believe you, but the review is procedural. I can't stop it." "What does a review mean?" "It means an investigator looks at your access logs for the past 60 days, standard process. It usually takes 2 to 3 weeks. A pause. "In the meantime, you're on full active status. Nothing changes, but I wanted you to know before you came in tomorrow." Emily pressed her back against the concrete pillar. The parking structure hummed. Car passed on the level below. Lorraine Voss. Billing. 3rd floor. Triple Pine AZ. She didn't know yet, but the shape of it was there. "Karen, the community advocate listed on Diane's documentation, do you know how long Lorraine Voss has worked at the hospital?" 7 years. "And how long has the informal HOA been operating under Diane Whitmore?" Silence. Then, "You think they know each other?" "I think Diane didn't tag Hargrove Regional out of nowhere. Someone told her the name of the department, someone who works there." Emily kept her voice even. "And someone filed a complaint within 12 hours of Diane making a public accusation. That's coordinated." Karen was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to pull Lorraine's HR record in the morning." "Don't tell anyone you're doing it." "I know how to do my job, Emily." "I know you do." "I'm sorry." She hung up. Stood in the garage until she was sure she had all of it accounted for. Not under control, she didn't believe in pretending things were under control when they weren't, but accounted for, mapped, understood as clearly as it could be understood with the information she had. Then she walked to her car and drove home. Marcus was in the kitchen when she got there. He'd made dinner, which meant he'd been worried, because he only cooked when he didn't know what else to do with his hands. He looked at her face and said, "That bad?" "There's someone at the hospital," she said, "connected to Diane. I think they've been coordinating." She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which he was good at, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling in the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts. The food sat between them, getting lukewarm. "So this isn't just Diane," he said. "It never was, not really." Emily picked up a fork, put it down. Diane found a target she thought she could push around, but someone helped her. Someone who knew where I worked, what department, how to file through the internal portal. An insider. With enough motivation to go after me specifically. She looked at him. Which means I did something to create that motivation. Marcus frowned. What? When? You've been here 2 months. I don't know yet. She left her dinner half eaten and went to her laptop. She pulled up everything she had on Lorraine Voss, which was not much because she had no reason to have researched a billing employee before tonight. But she found her name in the Cedar Hollow Neighborhood Group's member list, which was public, and cross-referenced it with the Triple Pine AZ comment timestamps, and the pattern tightened. The comments had started 6 weeks ago. 1 week after Emily moved in. Not after the first letter. Not after the HOA confrontation. 1 week after she signed the lease on the house. She sat back. The room was quiet except for Marcus loading dishes into the sink and the ambient sounds of the evening, the same sounds that had felt like normalcy 2 weeks ago. Her mind moved through the timeline carefully, the way she'd been trained to move through a casualty scene, not jumping to conclusions, not skipping steps, but accounting for what was there. Why would Lorraine Voss start paying attention to a new neighbor 1 week after she moved in? Not after a complaint, not after a dispute. From the beginning, which meant either Lorraine had been watching the property specifically, not Emily, the property, or someone had told her to watch for whoever moved in. Emily opened the county records again. Not the HOA dissolution this time, the property transfer. The house at 14 Willow Crest had been sold to Emily and Marcus Carter. It had previously been owned by a man named Gerald Voss. She stared at the screen. Gerald Voss. Sold the property 18 months ago, prior owner for 11 years, address listed as 14 Willow Crest, Cedar Hollow. She typed the name into the neighborhood group search. Gerald Voss appeared in 3 posts. The third one was from 2 years ago, written by Diane Whitmore, thanking the community for their support during the difficult matter with the Voss property, and expressing her hope that the neighborhood would return to the standards we've worked so hard to maintain. Emily read it twice. Then she searched for Voss and Whitmore together. The result was a 3-year-old comment thread she almost missed because it had been mostly deleted. Only fragments remained, captured in reply notifications. But the shape was clear enough. There had been a dispute. Gerald Voss had contested Diane's HOA fees. He had apparently pushed back hard, and then he'd sold the house. Emily sat very still. Lorraine Voss was watching the property that used to belong to Gerald Voss, and she was connected to Diane Whitmore, which meant either she was Gerald's relative who blamed the previous owners for losing the house, which made no sense, or she had been part of Diane's operation from the beginning, and Gerald Voss had left because the pressure had become too much, and now someone new had moved into that house and picked up the fight Gerald had dropped. Except Emily wasn't going to drop it. She was reaching for her phone to call Karen back with this information when the notification appeared on her screen. A message from Rosa Delgado, sent 9 minutes ago to the group thread she'd set up for the affected families. Diane's attorney sent a certified letter tonight. She's filing suit against all of us. Says we defamed her, all 7 households. She wants damages. Emily read it twice. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. The voice was not Diane's. It was not Sandra Pratt's. It was a man, calm, professional, with the specific cadence of someone who chose their words with the deliberateness of training. Ms. Carter, my name is Special Agent Daniel Morrow. I'm with the Federal Housing Fraud Task Force Southwest Division. I understand you filed a complaint with the County Housing Authority regarding Cedar Hollow subdivision. I've been trying to reach you for the past 2 hours. Emily's hand was steady. Her voice was steady. Everything she'd built over 6 years of work in conditions most people never encountered had come down to this particular quality. The ability to remain functional when the situation shifted faster than the plan. I'm here, she said. We need to meet, Morrow said. Tonight, if possible. Ms. Carter, Cedar Hollow isn't the only subdivision. We've been building a case for 14 months. and yours may be the piece we've been missing." "Where?" Emily said. "There's a diner on Route 17, mile marker 42, Shepherd's. Can you be there in an hour?" She was already reaching for her keys. Marcus was standing in the kitchen doorway. He'd heard enough from her side of the call to know the shape of it. He handed her her jacket without being asked. "I'll be back," she said. "I know." She drove the 40 minutes to Shepherd's with the windows cracked despite the cold, because she needed the air moving and she needed to think. The road was mostly empty at that hour, just the occasional trucker and the flat dark of the desert on either side. She ran through what Morrow had said. Federal Housing Fraud Task Force. 14 months. Cedar Hollow wasn't the only subdivision. That last part was the piece she kept turning over. Not the only subdivision. She'd built her case around one street, one dissolved HOA, one woman with a clipboard and a logo she'd paid to have designed. But if the task force had been investigating for over a year, Diane Whitmore wasn't operating alone, and Cedar Hollow wasn't a local grievance that had gotten out of hand. It was part of something with a wider architecture. Shepherd's was a 24-hour place with vinyl booths and the kind of lighting that made everything look slightly overexposed. A man was already there in the back corner, a mid-40s, dark jacket, coffee untouched in front of him. He stood when she walked in, which she noticed, and offered his hand, which she shook. "Special Agent Morrow." "Emily Carter." They sat. He slid a credential across the table and she looked at it, the kind of look that checked details rather than just acknowledged the gesture. He watched her do it without comment, which told her something about him. "Your complaint to the county flagged in our system because of the property address," he said. 14 Willowcrest. Gerald Voss's old house. He didn't show surprise that she already knew the name. Gerald Voss filed a complaint with our office 11 months ago. He'd been harassed out of his home, fee demands, threats, and eventually a fabricated code violation that he believed would lead to a lien on the property. He sold at a loss to avoid the legal exposure. Morrow turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. He couldn't prove the lien threat was fabricated at the time. We started pulling records and found Cedar Hollow was one of 9 subdivisions across 3 counties where the same pattern was occurring. Same dissolved HOA structure? Variations. Some were never formally incorporated in the first place. Others had legitimate origins and were taken over. But the mechanism is consistent. Collect fees under false authority, manufacture violations, apply enough pressure to push out resistant owners, and in some cases, he paused, facilitate the resale of properties to buyers connected to the operation. Emily sat with that for a moment. "They're flipping houses." "We believe so. The fraud generates income directly from the fees, but the larger money comes from properties sold under duress at below market rates and then resold. We've traced 3 Cedar Hollow properties in the last 4 years that followed this pattern. Who buys them? That's what we've been working on. The buyers are LLCs, most registered in Nevada, most with ownership structures that are intentionally opaque. We've identified 2 principals so far. A third is proving difficult." He looked at her. "Diane Whitmore is not the architect of this. She's an operator, a very effective one, because she genuinely believes in what she's doing. The control, the standards, the authority. We think she was recruited because of that. Someone identified her as a useful tool." "Lorraine Voss," Emily said. Morrow went still. "She works in billing at Hargrove Regional. She's Gerald Voss's sister, I'm assuming. She filed an internal complaint against me tonight, and she's been coordinating with Diane on social media under a username." Emily put her phone on the table with the Triple Pine AZ screenshots pulled up. "She started watching my property the week I moved in, before any dispute started, which means she or someone she's connected to knew that house was significant." Morrow picked up her phone and looked at the screenshots for a long moment. His expression didn't change much, but there was a quality of attention that sharpened. "Lorraine Voss is Gerald Voss's daughter," he said, "not his sister, and she has a financial interest in 2 of the 3 LLCs we've identified." The diner was quiet around them. A cook moved behind the counter. A couple near the window talked in low voices about something that had nothing to do with any of this. "She's not protecting her father," Emily said. "She's protecting the operation." That's our assessment. Morrow set the phone down. Gerald Voss left that house because the pressure worked. What they didn't count on was him eventually talking to us. And they definitely didn't count on whoever bought that house being the kind of person who builds a 14-page complaint with certified county records. He said it without flattery. It was an assessment, same as hers had been. "What do you need from me?" Emily asked. "The documentation you've already assembled is significant, but the lawsuit Diane's attorney filed tonight changes the timeline." He pulled a folder from the bag beside him and laid it on the table. "If this goes to civil court, our case gets complicated. Their attorney will subpoena your records. Discovery becomes a problem for us." "Because it reveals the scope of your investigation." "Yes. We need to move before that happens." He looked at her steadily. "I want to brief you on what we have and what we need. And I want to ask if you're willing to continue what you're doing, documenting, communicating with the affected residents, while we prepare to execute." Emily looked at the folder. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. And in the meantime, I'm the one with an internal HR review at my hospital and a federal lawsuit with my name on it." "Yes." He didn't soften it. "I can't make those go away quickly. I can provide documentation to HR that puts your conduct in a different context, but the process still has to run." She appreciated that he didn't promise things he couldn't deliver. She'd worked with people who did that, who smoothed over the hard parts to get buy-in, and it always cost you later. "Tell me what you have," she said. He opened the folder. Moms. She got home at 1:15 in the morning. Marcus was asleep on the couch with his school papers on his chest and the television off, which meant he'd fallen asleep waiting, and the papers had slid there from his lap. She covered him with a throw blanket from the chair and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter in the dark for a few minutes, not quite ready to wind down. Morrow had shown her 9 subdivisions, fee collection records across 3 counties, LLC ownership trails that wound through Nevada and 2 other states. A pattern that had been running, in one form or another, for almost 7 years. Diane Whitmore had been operating Cedar Hollow's piece of it for 5 of those years, and in that time, she had pressured out at least 4 households, collected an estimated $22,000 in fraudulent fees from those who remained, and created enough legal noise to slow down every homeowner who'd tried to fight back. Gerald Voss had been the first to talk to the feds. 2 other former residents had since come forward, and now Emily's complaint, 14 pages, certified records, the specific and organized documentation of someone who'd been trained to record information accurately under pressure, had given the task force a current active paper trail from inside the operation. In 2 weeks, they were going to move. She went to bed. She slept 5 hours, which was more than she sometimes managed. The next morning, she drove to Hargrove Regional and went directly to Karen Wills's office before her shift started. Karen had Lorraine Voss's HR file open on her desk. She looked tired and slightly grim. "She's been here 7 years, Karen said. Clean record, decent performance reviews." She paused. She filed the ethics complaint at 11:43 p.m. That's not normal. People don't file ethics complaints in the middle of the night unless something prompted them to do it right then. "Something did," Emily said. Diane Whitmore posted publicly at 11:15. Lorraine filed 28 minutes later. Karen absorbed that. Coordinated. "I met with a federal agent last night. I can't share specifics, but I can tell you there's an active investigation and I've been asked to cooperate with it. I'm going to email you the agent's contact information today. He said he can provide context to administration about my conduct." Karen looked at her. "How big is this?" "Bigger than Cedar Hollow." Karen closed the file. She looked like someone who had come into work expecting a routine HR review and was now recalibrating in real time. "I'll put the access log review on hold while I contact the agent." "I'd appreciate that." "Emily," Karen's voice was careful. "Are you okay? Not procedurally. Actually okay." The question caught her slightly off guard, which was itself a kind of answer. She'd been in operational mode for 2 weeks, and the human texture of things had been running underneath rather than on top. "I'm functional," she said. "I'll let you know if that changes." Karen nodded. "Go do your job. I'll handle this end." The shift was a standard morning rotation, heavier than typical because 2 staff members were out sick, which meant Emily was covering more floor time than usual on top of the charge duties. She moved through it the way she always moved through a hard shift, task by task, patient by patient, not thinking about Cedar Hollow or Lorraine Voss or the federal task force or Sandra Pratt's lawsuit, because none of that would help the 68-year-old man in Bay 7 with the chest pain that might be cardiac and might be musculoskeletal and required the same careful attention either way. She was at the nurse's station at 2 in the afternoon when she looked up and saw a woman she didn't recognize standing at the main desk asking for her. Mid-50s. Well-dressed in the specific way of someone who worked in legal or finance. Carrying a leather portfolio. Emily crossed the floor. "Can I help you?" "Ms. Carter, I'm Renata Bloom. I represent the 9 households named in the defamation suit filed yesterday by Whitmore Properties, LLC. Emily registered the name. Whitmore Properties. Diane Whitmore's legal entity, registered 18 months ago. Her attorney filed the suit under that name. Renata Bloom had the manner of someone who had litigated enough to have stopped finding any of it surprising. "I was retained this morning by a coalition of the affected homeowners. Rosa Delgado coordinated the contact. I'm here because I need 30 minutes with you and I understand you're working. I'm on until 6. I'll come back at 6:15. She handed Emily a card. "I also want you to know that the Whitmore Properties registration gave us something we didn't have before. She incorporated 11 months ago, 2 weeks after Gerald Voss sold his house." She paused. "The timing matters." She left. Emily held the card and stood at the nurse's station while the department moved around her. Whitmore Properties, a formal legal entity, which meant Diane wasn't just a self-appointed HOA president with a logo and a clipboard. At some point in the last year, she or someone advising her had moved the operation into a structure with legal standing, which was either a defensive move anticipating scrutiny or an offensive one preparing for expansion. Emily forwarded the name tomorrow's number with a single line. Whitmore Properties, LLC. Registered 11 months ago. Your team have this? His reply came back in 4 minutes. Yes. It's in the wire. The wire. Which meant they were past the documentation phase. She put her phone away and went back to the floor. Renata Bloom came back at 6:20 with a yellow legal pad and the focused energy of someone who'd spent the afternoon building momentum. They sat in a small conference room that usually held shift handoffs. The defamation suit names 9 households and seeks $240,000 in damages, Renata said. The basis is that you and the other residents conspired to file false reports with the county and spread misinformation that damaged Whitmore Properties' business reputation. Business reputation, Emily said. She's claiming the LLC was a legitimate property management company and your complaint destroyed a pending contract. Renata looked up from her pad. There is no pending contract. We checked. But the filing is professionally constructed. Someone with real litigation experience wrote this. Sandra Pratt, who is, it turns out, not a solo practitioner. She's associated with a firm in Phoenix called Aldrich, Pratt, and Keller. They have a civil litigation practice and also do LLC incorporation work. Renata set her pen down. They incorporated Whitmore Properties. Emily looked at the table, then back at Renata. So Diane's attorney helped her create the legal entity she's now using to sue us, and likely helped structure it to survive initial scrutiny. Renata's expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, exactly. Recognition. This isn't someone who spontaneously decided to fight back. She was advised to do this. The lawsuit was probably drafted before you even filed the county complaint. The conference room was quiet. Through the window in the door, Emily could see the hallway, the ordinary end of an ordinary shift. What do you need from me? Emily asked. Everything you have, which I understand is considerable. A slight pause that might have been professional appreciation. I also need to know about the federal involvement. I can't share case details, but I can confirm it exists and that the timing of what you're describing may intersect with their work. Renata looked at her steadily. If there's a federal investigation active, this defamation suit is going to collapse the moment it becomes known. Filing suit against people who are cooperating with a federal fraud investigation is a very particular kind of mistake. I know. I want to file a motion to dismiss on Friday. I need your documentation by tomorrow morning. Emily nodded. You'll have it by 9. Renata closed the legal pad. She looked at Emily with a directness that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't performing warmth either. Rosa Delgado told me what happened in the driveway, with the federal credentials. It was a straightforward situation. She said you didn't raise your voice once. Emily looked at the door. Raising my voice wouldn't have helped. Renata stood and gathered her portfolio. No, I suppose not. She extended her hand. I'll see you Friday. Emily drove home in the dark, the same road she'd driven to meet Morrow, the same desert on both sides. She was tired in the way that settled into your bones at the end of a day that had asked more than sleep debt could explain. Marcus had gotten takeout from the Thai place on Miller Street. He'd already separated hers into a container and put it in the refrigerator because he knew she sometimes didn't eat until she'd had 20 minutes to decompress. She sat at the kitchen table and ate, and told him about Renata Bloom and Whitmore Properties and the lawsuit timeline. He listened. He ate his own food. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. They built the attack before they knew how you'd respond, he said. Yes. Which means they were afraid of you from the beginning. She considered that, or afraid of whoever moved into that house. They didn't know who was moving in. They found out and they still went ahead with it. He pushed his container aside. That's not someone who's scared. That's someone who thought they could handle you. Emily was quiet. They were wrong, Marcus said. It wasn't triumphant. It was just the simple assessment of a man who knew her. She nodded, finished eating, washed her container, did the small, ordinary things that the day required and that grounded her in the reality of the house she had chosen and was not going to be pushed out of. She was at her laptop at 9:30, assembling the documentation for Renata when her phone rang. Morrow again. We have a problem, he said, and his voice had a different quality than it had at the diner. Tighter, more careful. Lorraine Voss left her position at Hargrove this afternoon. She cleaned out her desk. Emily's fingers stopped over the keyboard. She resigned? We don't know yet. She may have been advised to, but she also accessed a shared document server in the hospital billing system before she left. He paused. We're trying to determine if she removed anything. What kind of documents does billing have that would matter to your case? Insurance records, property-linked insurance claims. We've been looking at whether some of the LLC properties were involved in fraudulent insurance claims that ran through Hargrove's system, providers billing the same addresses. He stopped. It's possible she tipped someone off that were close. Emily closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. How close? She asked. Close enough that we were going to wait 2 weeks. He paused. We may not have 2 weeks anymore. She looked at the documentation spread across her screen. 14 pages of complaint, 7 families' worth of records, Renata's motion to dismiss, the LLC registration, Sandra Pratt's firm, the Triple Pine AZ screenshots, Gerald Voss's property transfer. Everything she'd built, carefully, methodically, the way she'd been trained to account for what was in front of her and not what she wished was there instead. What do you need me to do? She asked. Nothing different, Morrow said. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. Send Renata the documentation. Be at work tomorrow. Be visible and be normal. A brief pause. And Emily, don't be alone with anyone connected to Whitmore Properties. Not Diane, not Lorraine if she surfaces, not Sandra Pratt. The instruction was specific enough to carry weight. You think they'd... I think when operations start to unravel, people get less predictable. His voice was measured, not alarmed. Standard precaution. She sat with that after she hung up. The house was quiet. Marcus was in the other room. Outside, the neighborhood she'd moved into 2 months ago to be ordinary and stable, and finished with the kind of days that required this much of her. That neighborhood was the same as it had always been. Oleander along fence lines, sprinklers set on timers, lights going off in windows one by one. At 11:47, her laptop pinged, an email from Rosa Delgado to the group thread. Subject line, someone put a notice on my door. Emily opened it. A photograph of a printed notice slipped under Rosa's front door. On HOA letterhead, Diane Whitmore's logo in the corner. It cited Rosa for repeated community disruption and interference with legitimate management operations, and stated that under Whitmore Properties LLC's authority, as designated community management, Rosa Delgado's property was subject to a formal lien review. A lien, the same mechanism that had pushed Gerald Voss out of his house. At the bottom, handwritten in blue pen, "This applies to all 9 households, effective immediately." Emily read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Morrow with one line. "She's moving tonight." His reply came back in under 3 minutes, and it was 4 words. "So are we. Stand by." Emily didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her phone and the folder of documents she'd spent 2 weeks building, and she waited. Marcus came out at midnight, read the situation without asking, and made coffee without being told. He sat across from her and didn't talk, which was exactly right. There was nothing useful to say. What was happening now was past the point where words moved anything. Morrow sent a single update at 12:43. "Team is in position. Do not contact Whitmore or any associate. Stay home." She replied, "Understood." And then she waited some more. The night had the specific quality of nights before operations. She'd had enough of them to know the texture, the stillness that wasn't peaceful, the way small sounds became loud, the awareness of your own breathing. She'd sat like this in vehicles outside buildings, in tents with radios going quiet, in staging areas where everyone was doing the same calculation of what they'd trained for against what was actually about to happen. It never felt the way movies made it look. It felt like this, like a kitchen table and cold coffee and the desert dark outside the window. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone lit up with a news alert. Federal agents execute search warrants in Maricopa and Pinal counties in connection with multi-county housing fraud investigation. She turned the screen so Marcus could see it. He read it, said nothing, set it back down. At 2:51, Morrow called. "It's done," he said. "Whitmore Properties, LLC, 3 associated entities, and a property management firm in Scottsdale. We executed simultaneously." A pause that was not drama, just the particular exhale of someone who'd been running at operational tempo for 14 months. Diane Whitmore was taken into custody at her home approximately 40 minutes ago. Lorraine Voss was apprehended at a storage facility in Tempe. She'd gone there after leaving the hospital. We believe she was attempting to remove documents. Emily's hand was flat on the table. "What about Sandra Pratt? Her firm is under subpoena. She's not in custody. Attorney issues are more complex, but she's not going anywhere." Another pause. "The defamation suit is effectively dead. You can't maintain a civil action when the entity filing it is under federal seizure." Emily closed her eyes, opened them. "The lien notices," she said. "The ones from tonight." Void. She had no legal authority to file them, and the properties are now frozen under the seizure order. No homeowner in any of the 9 subdivisions will be touched by those. He stopped. "Emily, you built the cleanest documentation in 9 active cases. I want you to know that." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said, "Thank you for calling. Someone from the task force will contact you in the morning about formal statements. Get some sleep." She hung up. Marcus was watching her from across the table. He looked tired and a little stunned and very steady, which was who he was. "It's done?" he said. "It's done." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. She sat there for a while longer, not quite able to make herself move, because there was something about the end of a thing that required its own kind of adjustment. You built toward a point for long enough, and then the point arrived, and the structure you'd built to reach it was still standing in you, even though the reason for it was gone. She'd felt this before. In the field, after the thing you'd prepared for was over, and the preparing was still running in your nervous system, with nowhere to go. She went to bed at 3:30. She slept until 7, which was more than she expected. The morning was loud in the way mornings after major events always were, not literally, but in the amount of information arriving from multiple directions. Rosa Delgado called at 7:40. Her voice was shaking slightly, not with distress, but with the specific emotional discharge of someone who'd been holding tension for a long time. "I saw the news," Is it real? It's real. They arrested her? Yes. A sound on Rosa's end that was part breath, part something harder to name. My husband's been awake since midnight. He saw the alert. He didn't want to wake me, and then he woke me anyway because he said he couldn't hold it by himself. Emily understood that completely. What happens to the fees we paid? Rosa asked. That's part of the investigation. Renata Bloom will be the right person to talk to about restitution. I'll send you her number again if you don't have it. We paid over $400 over 2 years. I know. Keep all your records. Patricia called 15 minutes later. Then Helen Nguyen. Then David Nguyen separately, because apparently they'd been on different floors of the house when they saw the news. Each call had its own shape. Some people needed confirmation, some needed to process out loud, some just needed to hear another voice that had been in it with them. Emily gave each call what it needed, which took time and more emotional bandwidth than she would have admitted if Marcus had asked. But he was smart enough not to ask. By 9, she'd emailed Renata the full documentation package and received a response within 20 minutes. Motion to dismiss is now moot. I'm filing a notice of the federal action with the court this morning. The suit is dead. I'll be in touch re-restitution claims. That was clean and satisfying in the way that purely procedural things sometimes were. She went into Hargrove at noon, not because she was scheduled, but because Karen Wills had asked her to come in for a conversation, and because, frankly, she wanted to be somewhere with structure and purpose rather than sitting at home waiting for more news to arrive. Karen's office had the slightly cluttered dignity of someone who'd worked in the same room long enough to stop noticing the accumulation. She waved Emily in and closed the door. The access log review is closed, Karen said. The investigator looked at 60 days of records, and there's nothing irregular. Obviously. She paused. Lorraine Voss's employment file is now in the hands of the county prosecutor. I spoke to Agent Morrow this morning. I know he called you. He gave me a great deal of context. Karen looked at her with the directness of someone who'd been doing HR work long enough to have stopped filtering everything through professional distance. I owe you an apology. You don't, Emily said. You followed the process. I followed the process slowly when I should have trusted my read of the situation faster. She folded her hands on the desk. Administration has been briefed. Dr. Hargrove himself, which I want you to understand is not a thing that happens for routine matters. She let that land. The ethics complaint is expunged from your record. It will not appear in any review, any renewal, any background check. It's gone. Emily nodded. There's also something else. Karen shifted slightly, and Emily recognized the tell of someone about to say something they weren't quite sure how to frame. Dr. Reed put something in your file last week, after the Route 17 incident response. He wrote a formal commendation. Said you ran the most organized mass casualty intake he'd seen in 8 years at this facility. She paused. I thought you should know. Emily sat with that. She hadn't known. Reed hadn't mentioned it. He didn't tell you, Karen said. It wasn't a question. No. He's not someone who mentions things. She gave a small, dry smile. It's in the file. It'll matter. Emily thanked her and meant it and left. The formal statement with the task force happened the following morning at a field office in Flagstaff that looked like every federal workspace, functional, slightly fluorescent, built for work rather than comfort. Morrow was there with 2 other agents and a woman from the county prosecutor's office named Teresa Okafor, who had the careful precision of someone who weighed every word before she spent it. They went through the documentation for 2 hours, every letter, every fee demand, every date, every record. Emily walked them through her timeline, and they annotated it against their own, and the places where the lines matched were documented, and the places where Emily's records filled gaps in theirs were noted specifically. At one point, Okafor put down her pen and said, Ms. Carter, how long did it take you to build this? 2 weeks. The certified records alone would have taken most people a month. I knew what to look for, Emily said. Your military background. Partly, and I was motivated. Teresa Okafor smiled briefly. It changed her face completely. I imagine. The scope of what Morrow's team had uncovered was larger than Emily had understood even from their diner conversation. 11 subdivisions across 3 counties, 36 households that had paid fraudulent fees, 14 properties sold under duress, several of which had already been resold at significant profit through the LLC network. The total estimated fraud was somewhere above $800,000, which meant this wasn't a neighborhood nuisance case. It was a coordinated financial crime with the infrastructure to survive scrutiny for years. Diane Whitmore, Morrow explained, had been a franchise operator. She'd been approached in 2019 by a man named Russell Aldrich, Sandra Pratt's senior partner at the Phoenix firm, and offered a fee-sharing arrangement. She got to play HOA president, which was what she wanted. She got a cut of the fees she collected, and she got the satisfaction of running something, which had turned out to be worth more to her than the money. Aldrich's firm provided the legal architecture and the LLC structure. Lorraine Voss provided the intelligence network, identifying properties, researching new owners, filing interference actions when someone pushed back too hard. It was, in Morrow's assessment, professionally designed. It had worked for 5 years because it was designed to be too small to look federal and too persistent to be worth fighting individually. Until someone fought it individually, Teresa Okafor said, and she was looking at Emily when she said it. Emily didn't perform modesty about it. She'd done the work. She'd done it because she was the kind of person who did the work when the work was in front of her, and she didn't need to make it larger than that. Someone was going to eventually, she said. Gerald Voss tried, Morrow said. He didn't have what you had. He didn't have the documentation background, Emily said. He had the same situation. The documentation matters, Okafor said. In cases like this, the documentation is the case. Without it, we have patterns that are suggestive. With yours, we had a viable complaint that compelled the county to respond, which gave us the legal hook to accelerate. She paused. Your military credentials on that driveway changed the temperature of the initial police call. Your documentation changed the temperature of everything else. Emily looked at her. What happens to Diane? She's facing federal charges, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false statements. Her attorney, not Sandra Pratt, she's got a different one now, is likely going to explore a cooperation agreement because Aldrich is the primary target. Okafor set down her pen. She'll face consequences, public ones. The cooperation, if it happens, reduces her exposure but doesn't eliminate it. She won't be running any HOA, legitimate or otherwise, for a very long time. Lorraine Voss? Conspiracy, fraud, potential obstruction charges related to the document removal at the storage facility. A pause. She's in a difficult position. She used her hospital access to facilitate the intelligence side of this. That implicates Hargrove Regional in a way the hospital is not going to take lightly. Russell Aldrich? Morrow answered this one. Federal charges. His firm is under criminal investigation. Sandra Pratt's involvement is being evaluated. She may have been following client instructions without full knowledge of the scope, or she may have been a knowing participant. That determination takes time. He looked at Emily. But Aldrich is the one who built this. He's the one who goes down hardest. She nodded, filed it. One more thing, Morrow said. The properties. The ones sold under duress through the LLC network. The task force has a restitution unit. It's going to be a slow process, and not everyone will recover everything. But the investigation is going to be public, and the public record of how those sales happen will stand. Gerald Voss would know, eventually, that the house he'd lost wasn't lost because he'd failed. It was lost because he'd been pushed out by something organized and deliberate. Emily didn't know if that helped. Sometimes knowing the shape of what happened to you helped. Sometimes it just made it more specific. She signed her formal statement, shook hands with Morrow and Okafor and the 2 other agents whose names she'd already committed to memory out of habit, and walked out of the federal field office into the Flagstaff afternoon, which was cold and bright and very clear. She sat in her car for 5 minutes before driving home. The news story ran 4 days later. It wasn't a small story. An $800,000 housing fraud operation across 3 counties with a law firm at the center and a network of shell companies was the kind of thing that ran above the fold in the Arizona papers and got picked up by the wire services. The names were all there: Aldrich, Pratt, Whitmore, Voss. The mechanism was explained, the scope was detailed, The quotes from the county prosecutor's office were measured and specific. Emily's name appeared twice, once in connection with the county complaint that had triggered the task force acceleration, and once in a single line that identified her as a former military combat nurse whose documentation had been described by investigators as instrumental. She read the article at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Marcus made eggs. She read it once, set her phone down, and watched him cook. "You want to talk about it?" he said without turning around. "Not particularly." "Okay." He made the eggs. They ate. Outside, the Arizona morning was doing the slow, golden thing it did on weekends, the light moving across the yard in a way that still made her notice it because she hadn't been here long enough to take it for granted. 3 days after the story ran, Patricia Turnbull knocked on the door. She was holding a casserole dish, which she extended with the particular awkwardness of someone who wasn't sure if the gesture was right, but had decided to make it anyway. "It's chicken and rice," she said. "I make it when I don't know what else to do." Emily took it. "Thank you." Patricia stood on the porch. She looked older than she had that first morning at the kitchen table, but also something else, lighter, maybe, in the specific way of someone who'd been carrying a weight so long they'd stopped recognizing it as weight. "Dale saw the article," she said. "My husband. He cried." She paused. "He doesn't usually do that." Emily said nothing because sometimes silence was the right thing to hold a moment. "We paid $620 over 4 years, Patricia said. "I did the math after the article. I had to look it up because I hadn't let myself add it up before." She looked at Emily directly. "You didn't have to do any of this. It was the right thing to do." "A lot of people know what the right thing is," Patricia said. "Not that many do it when it costs something." Emily held the casserole dish and looked at the woman who'd come to her kitchen table 6 weeks ago with her mail held against her chest like a shield, and felt the weight of what Patricia had just said in a way that was difficult to put anywhere tidy. "Come in," Emily said. "Marcus is home." The restitution process took months, as Morrow had warned. It was slow and required documentation, and involved several rounds of back and forth with the county. Rosa Delgado's $400 came back first. The Nguyen's restitution was more complex because their situation involved a separate false complaint that had required them to hire an attorney 2 years prior. That additional claim took longer to process. The Garcias got confirmation of their restitution amount in February, and Miriam sent Emily a text that said only, "For Antonio. He's 13 now. Thank you." Emily saved that one. The formal charges against Diane Whitmore were filed in November. She entered a cooperation agreement in January, which meant she agreed to testify against Russell Aldrich in exchange for reduced charges. The federal fraud count stayed. The cooperation reduced her exposure on the conspiracy charge. She was looking at a sentencing range that her new attorney characterized in a statement to the press as appropriate to the circumstances. The circumstances were 5 years of systematic fraud, 14 displaced families, and a child who had cried at 12 years old because a woman with a clipboard and a fake logo had told him his family might have to leave. Emily read the charge filing on her lunch break and then went back to work. Russell Aldrich was indicted in December on 16 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. His firm dissolved the week the indictment was announced. Sandra Pratt accepted a deferred prosecution agreement contingent on full cooperation with investigators and surrendered her license to practice in Arizona pending review. It was not a clean ending for either of them, which was, Emily thought, the appropriate kind of ending for what they'd built. Lorraine Voss pled guilty to conspiracy and obstruction in February. The hospital filed a civil suit against her separately for misuse of access credentials. Her sentencing was scheduled for spring. The neighborhood changed in small ways. Not dramatically, not all at once. Neighborhoods didn't work like that, Emily had learned. Or maybe she'd always known it and had needed Cedar Hollow to confirm it. But people talked to each other differently. The Delgados had the Nguyens over for dinner in November, and Rosa mentioned it to Emily the next day in a way that suggested it was something that hadn't happened before. David Nguyen started a neighborhood watch, a real one, informal, just a group text and a willingness to pay attention. Old Mr. Vasquez on the corner had always said hello, but now he sometimes stopped to talk, which was a different thing. Patricia's husband Dale came over one Saturday in late January to help Marcus with a fence repair Marcus had been attempting alone with mixed results. He showed up with his own tools and did not ask permission first, which Emily found endearing in the specific way of men who expressed care through showing up rather than announcing it. He and Marcus spent 4 hours on the fence and came inside for coffee after, and the four of them sat in the kitchen in the particular ease of people who had arrived at familiarity through difficulty rather than proximity. "You gonna stay?" Dale asked Emily. It was a direct question, unself-conscious. "We're staying," she said. He nodded like this settled something he'd been quietly wondering about. Sure. The phone call that mattered most came in March. It was from a woman named Dr. Sandra Iwata, who introduced herself as the Director of Emergency Preparedness for the Flagstaff Regional Health Coalition, a consortium of medical facilities across northern Arizona that coordinated mass casualty response protocols. She had seen the commendation in Emily's file, she said, and had also spoken to Dr. Reed and had been aware of Emily's background for several months before calling. "I'm putting together an advisory team," Dr. Iwata said. "People who can help standardize triage and mass casualty protocols across facilities in the region. Most of what we have is outdated and was written by administrators rather than people who've worked in field conditions." A pause. "I'd like to talk to you about a part-time consulting role. It would run alongside your position at Hargrove." Emily was standing in the break room, which was where she always seemed to be when calls like this arrived. What would it involve? Protocol review? Training design? Occasional simulation oversight? Dr. Iwata's voice had the quality of someone who wasn't pitching but was laying out facts. "You'd have direct input on standards that would affect how 12 facilities respond to major incidents." Emily thought about the Route 17 response, about the 40-minute window between the radio call and the last patient stabilized, about the things she'd improvised because the existing protocols hadn't accounted for that specific configuration of casualties and resources, and the fact that she'd had to improvise at all because no one had written something better yet. "When would you need an answer?" she asked. "Take a week." She took 4 days. She said yes on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table that had become the site of so many things. The first coffee with Patricia and Rosa, the documentation folders, the midnight news alert, the casserole dish, the four of them and their coffee cups in January. Marcus was still at school. The house was quiet. She called Dr. Iwata back and said yes and listened to the practical details and wrote down the dates and hung up. Then she sat there for a while. She had moved to Cedar Hollow to be ordinary. That had been genuine. She'd wanted the yard, the routine, the predictable. She'd wanted to stop being the person in the room that everything depended on, at least for a while. To have problems the size of a guest bathroom seal rather than a field hospital in a heat index of 112. What she'd found instead was that you didn't get to retire the version of yourself that knew how to fight for something. You could put it down for a while. You could sleep past 5 and plant ferns on your porch and trade shifts to wait for a plumber. But when someone came to your driveway with a clipboard and the confidence of someone who'd never been held accountable, and when behind her there were 36 households who'd paid money they didn't owe, and a 12-year-old boy who'd cried, and a man who'd sold his house at a loss rather than keep fighting alone, the version of you that knew how to build a case and hold a line and stay calm when everything was calibrated to make you feel small was going to come forward whether you invited it or not. Diane Whitmore had looked at Emily Carter and seen a quiet young nurse who would fold under pressure. She had seen the scrubs and the ferns and the measured voice and the hands she kept clasped behind her back. And she had made the oldest miscalculation there was. She had assumed that calm was the same as weak. That someone who didn't raise their voice had nothing behind it. That a woman who didn't fight the first few letters was a woman who wouldn't fight at all. She had been wrong in the specific, irreversible way that people are wrong when they underestimate someone who has simply been choosing not to show them what they're capable of. Emily didn't feel triumphant about it. She didn't feel, if she was being honest, the way she'd imagined she might feel at the end of something like this. There was no clean satisfaction, no sense of a score settled. What there was instead was something more durable and less exciting, a kind of solid settling. The sense of having done the work that was in front of her and having done it without losing herself in the process, without letting Diane's contempt become her anger. without letting the pressure compress her into something smaller and easier to dismiss. She'd stayed herself. Under the HOA letters and the police cruisers and the social media posts and the ethics complaint and the federal lawsuit and the 12 nights she didn't sleep enough. She had stayed underneath all of it, the person who knew what she was doing and why. And that was not a small thing. She had watched people lose that in far worse situations than this one. The ferns were still on the porch. Both of them. She had not moved them once. Marcus came home at 4:30 and found her at the table with her laptop open and a cup of tea she'd made an hour ago and forgotten about. He dropped his bag, loosened his tie, and looked at her with the particular attention he used when he was taking an accurate reading rather than a polite one. "You said yes," he said. "How did you know?" "You look like you said yes." He sat down across from her. The Iwata thing. The Iwata thing. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you good?" She thought about the question, the real version of it, not the reflex. "Yeah," she said. "I think I actually am." Outside, the March afternoon was moving toward evening in the slow burn way of the Arizona desert, the light going amber and long across the yard. The ferns on the porch were doing fine. They were the same ferns she'd carried from Virginia through 2 states and a broken air conditioner and 6 months in storage. They'd survived worse than Cedar Hollow, same as she had, and they'd come out the other side still green. She picked up her cold tea and drank it anyway. Some things you did not need to be perfect to be worth keeping. You just needed to be real and standing and unwilling to be moved from the place that was yours. That was enough. It had always been enough. It had just taken a woman with a clipboard and a fake logo to remind her that she'd known that all along.